Welcome to Section 3, Lesson 1, Adding and Subtracting Integers Symbolically. Here we're going to look at developing some rules for adding integers. So we'll start by looking at some completed equations that we've already done using manipulatives, and then see if we can find a pattern. So in the first case, let's consider adding a negative and a negative. So here's an example we did in a previous video using integer counters. And here's another example using a number line. So what do you notice about the answer in each case? Well, in both of these examples, the answer was negative. And that will actually always be the case. So if you look at A, here we have some negative counters, and then we added some more negative counters. Since there's no positive counters in sight to create zero pairs, all you're going to have is a bunch of negative counters. So we can see that our answer is always going to be negative. If we consider the number line, if we start with a negative number to the left of 0, and then add on a negative number, which just brings us further to the left, we'll always end up to the left of 0, which will always be negative. So you can see either way, we always get a negative number when you add two negatives. So now what is the rule we're going to create? Well, if I have negative 3 plus negative 2, I see that the answer is negative 5. So what we can do is just add the numbers together and then make the answer negative. So if I look at B, I have negative 3 plus negative 4. Adding 3 plus 4 together gives me 7, and because they're both negative, I make it negative 7. So here we have our first rule for adding integers. Now let's consider this case where we're adding a positive number with a negative number. So here's an example using integer counters where we started off with 8 positive counters and then we added 6 negative counters. We ended up with a positive 2. And in this example, we started at positive 6 on the number line and then moved 9 spaces to the left, ending up at negative 3. So I notice here that our answer could either be positive or negative. So how are we going to figure out what our answer is going to be? Well, if you look at A, I see that it was clearly a positive number simply because there were more positive counters. So that has to influence our answer. If you have more positive counters, you're going to end up with a positive number. But if it was more negative counters, your final answer would be negative. You can see that as well if you look at the number line. If I start at positive 6 and I add on a number that's smaller than 6, then I'll still end up on the right-hand side of 0 and end up with a positive number. But if I add on a number that's larger than 6, moving over into the negatives, like negative 9, then my answer would be negative. So in either case, you can see how the size of the positive and negative numbers influence what your answer is going to be. So what's our rule? Well, I'm going to first note that if there's more negatives, then our answer is going to be negative. And if there's more positives, our answer is going to be positive. So if I look at 8 plus negative 6, to get 2, we can subtract those numbers. And if I have positive 6 and negative 9, to get an answer of 3, I can again subtract. So what we're going to do is subtract the numbers and then look to see if you have more positives and negatives to write in the correct sign. So that is our second rule. So now our last case to consider is if we're adding a positive and a positive. Well, this should look very familiar, because a positive 5 can simply be written as 5, and a positive 12 can simply be written as 12. So this is what we're used to, 5 plus 12, which is just 17. So the rule for adding two positives is just simply do normal addition. So that's not really a new rule we need to remember. So now let's just practice what we learned. We have to determine the sum. So in A, we have a negative 2 plus a positive 7. Well, let's remind ourselves of the rules we just developed. If both of the integers are negative, we can just add the numbers together and make the answer negative. Now, if the integers have opposite signs, meaning one number is positive and the other number is negative, we can subtract the numbers and then afterwards determine if there's more negatives or positives. So in A, we have a negative and a positive, so that means we're going to subtract. So now 7 take away 2 is 5. Now I see that I have 7 positives but only 2 negatives, meaning my answer is going to be positive 5. Now in B, I have 2 negatives here, so this time I'm going to add. So if I add 8 plus 6 together, I get 14. And then I just simply put a negative sign in front of that. Now for C, I'm adding a negative with a positive, so that means I have opposite signs here, so I'm going to subtract. 30 take away 24 is 6. Now is it a positive 6 or is it a negative 6? Well, I have 30 negatives and only 24 positives, so I have more negatives here, so I'll put a negative in front of that 6. And then for the last one, I have a negative plus a negative, so let's add these together. 15 plus 5 is 20, and then just stick a negative in front of that. So these are the rules we're going to be using throughout this lesson. You can now move on to the next video.